somewhat different than it has in the past few months in the fact that we are going to turn to Daniel chapter number 1. Now you may be asking yourself, why are we returning once again to Daniel chapter 1? I believe that it is healthy for us on occasion to slow down and take an inventory of our understanding. This book of Daniel is particularly important in that aspect when we begin to look at some of the very hard prophecies that we've been talking about so far. So it's healthy for us to slow down and take an inventory, kind of go back and reread what it is, or re-understand, or relearn, or build upon our learning. And we do that by review. Now, we all learn by repetition. So I felt by the leading of the Spirit that today would be that day that we would go back and review. We'll go back and look at verses, or chapters rather, chapter 1 through chapter 10. Now, in chapters 11 and 12, Lord willing, next week, as we move into chapter number 11, we will once again have to wade into the deep end of the pool. And you've heard me say that before, that we dive into some of these prophecies and we dive into some of these issues that Daniel dealt with in his day, and we have to get into the deep end of the pool. And we've done that occasionally throughout this book. However, as we move into chapters 11 and 12, it's actually harder than wading into the deep end of the pool. It's actually more like trying to take a sip from a fire hose, or possibly put Lake Erie in a shot glass. This is the level of difficulty that we're going to move into in chapters 11 and 12. And remember, in chapter 10 that we finished up with the last time, this was the preamble to chapters 11 and 12 as one continuous thought. Even though they're broken up into chapters, it's still one continuous thought from chapter 10 all the way to chapter number 12. So I thought it would be healthy for us to back up to review chapter 1 through chapter 10. And I know what you're thinking. So my plan is to take 10 to 15 minutes for each chapter, 10 chapters, carry the ought. We should make it to work Monday morning. So let's pray and see what God has for us in our review today. Father, we thank you once again, as we often do, for the day, for your grace, for your mercy. But Father, we thank you today particularly for drawing us all here into this one building under this roof to hear from your word. Today is a day for the need of an attention span to be lengthened. We have the tendency in this lazy America to sit by oftentimes and move from article to article, from video to video. And our minds are actually learned nowadays to be very short in our attentions. Lord, I pray that you would supersede this meeting this morning, that you would knit our hearts together, that we would learn something from our review here today in these first 10 chapters of the book of Daniel. And I pray that you would supersede our meeting in the fact that you would have the preacher speak clearly and you have the listeners listen the same way. And I pray that you would do it today by the use of your Spirit, by the use of your word, by the use of the normal means of preaching. And I ask it and pray it in the name of your Son. Amen. So let's begin. Now, you look at the chapter as I give some commentary, and once in a while we're going to grab a couple of verses out of that chapter. So your job is to continue to follow along as I name these chapters off so that we can glass our eyes across that and grab a couple of verses as we move through. So look at chapter number 1. So the way the review goes is that Daniel, as well as many others in his day, were taken captive from Jerusalem to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. And if you remember, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. There was nothing left, completely bulldozed the thing over. There was nothing left in Jerusalem. And he takes people from Jerusalem, there's a few different waves, and he brings them into captivity in Babylon. And the idea was to bring these newfound captives into Babylon and actually indoctrinate them into Babylonian culture. So the idea was not to leave them as Jews in captivity for the rest of their lives, but actually make them Babylonians. And they did that by brainwashing classes that they had. They used the education system to do that. So in these few fellas that we see in chapter number 1, Nebuchadnezzar brings them in and he sends them to this school. And he begins to change everything about them. He changes their names. He changes their clothing. He even tries to change their diet. He changes the way they worship. He changes everything about them. So there is an intense learning of the Babylonian superiority in this classroom. The teachers would have taught these young up-and-coming leaders that Babylon was superior. They were superior in their culture. They were superior in their finances. They were superior in their security. After all, the walls of Babylon could not be penetrated. And they were obviously superior in their war tactics because they are speaking to those whom they have taken over. Now, Daniel and his friends in chapter 1 went along with everything. And they actually complied quietly. That is, until they were asked to eat meat sacrificed to idols. And they just couldn't do it. Look at verse number 8 in chapter number 1. It says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine that he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." So an alternative was come up by with Daniel and his friends. And the alternative was actually that they would eat veggies and drink only water for this allotted period of time. Now, there is no secret Daniel diet in verse 9 through 10 or 11. And I say that on purpose because Rick Warren and many others would have you believe that there is some kind of spiritual secret diet listed here in Daniel chapter 1. And if you begin to move down the road and partake in this diet, you too will be healthy. That's not at all what Daniel chapter 1 is talking about. You see, Daniel and his friends said, give us a time frame. We're going to eat only veggies and drink only water. And if we look any different than anybody else who's eating all of the king's fatted portions and drinking the king's wine, then forget it. We'll do the same. But if we can't be distinguished between any of the other youngsters and their diet by what we eat, then let us continue this diet. And what does it tell us in verse number 15? At the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter. Now, many people will say, well, that just means that they were very healthy. They appeared fat in the flesh, so it was very healthy. They appeared... No, they were just as fat as the ones who ate all of the king's delicacies and drank the king's wine. This was the miracle that God performed. They ate veggies and they drank water and they still got fat. We know if we have a diet that consists of nothing but veggies and water, we will not get fat. Rather, we will get skinny. That's not what happened to these two. So if you want to follow the Daniel diet, you better be praying that God makes you fat if you're going to follow it all the way. And I had to say that because it's out there, and it's out there everywhere. And when I hear it, it makes my skin crawl. Now, God honored their enthusiastic decision by actually having them appear fatter than all of the other kids at the end of the 10-day trial. And they were also blessed by receiving high-ranking positions in the government. So here they are, captives, brought in, and the king looks at them and says, "You guys are going to move right up the ranks." And this is God working with His people to establish people in high levels of government and establish people that would have some kind of authority. He's putting His own people in office in a foreign land. Now, the office had to do with those that could see the future and those that were very wise, the wise men. It wasn't, He didn't move them into temporary king or vice king, but they moved up the ranks. And as you can imagine, there were many people who were upset with this because they had worked as Babylonians. They went to school, they took all of the college classes, they spent all the money for the tuition, and their hope one day was to be a politician, and they just got beat out of a job by slaves. So as you can imagine, they weren't very happy. We move on to chapter 2. See, it wasn't that bad. Chapter number 2, we see King Nebuchadnezzar. He had a bad dream. This dream actually caused Nebuchadnezzar not to go back to sleep for quite some time. And an order went out by the king to all of the wise men of the country to give him the dream and the interpretation of the dream. And we talked about this early on. There were books that these wise men, these sorcerers, had in that day. And they were dream books. And if you came and said, "I had a dream about my high school, and I was standing at my locker, and when I looked down I realized I was in my underwear," well then I would leaf through this book and say, "Here's what's wrong with you. Here's the pizza that you had before you went to sleep." These books, they could interpret it by things that happened in their lives. Well, King Nebuchadnezzar says to his wise men, "I don't want any of that. I want you to tell me the interpretation of the dream and the dream I had." Well, as you can imagine, all the wise men thought, "You're out of your mind. We can't do that. We at least have to know the dream before we can go through our dream book to figure it out." He says, "No. As a matter of fact, you come up with the dream and its interpretation, or I kill you all." And Daniel gets word of it, and he goes and makes intercession and says, "You've got to slow him down just for a second. For a couple of days, give me a few days, give me a week." And he begins to pray. And God gives Daniel the revelation of the dream and the dream that the king had. So Daniel actually sets up a meeting with the king, and he begins to tell the king what he dreamed and the interpretation of the dream. And the dream had to do with a large statue. This large statue had some features with it. It was a funny looking statue. The head was made of gold. The chest and arms made from silver. Bronze through the torso and the thighs. And the legs made out of iron, which went to the feet of iron that were mixed with clay. And Daniel says, "That's the dream you had, and here's its interpretation." And he tells Nebuchadnezzar, "The head of gold is Babylon, and you are its king." That's all Nebuchadnezzar heard, because his head, just like the Grinch's heart, grew 10 times right there on the spot. Because when he heard that he was the head of gold, that's all he needed to hear. But Daniel continues to go on, and he says, the silver, that's Medo-Persia. La 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 la. The bronze are the Greeks. The iron and the iron mixed with clay feet are the Romans. And the mixing of the iron and clay together in the feet is a property that we would know that you cannot mix. If you mix iron and clay and put it in a kiln, it'll come out a mess. This is the fractions that happen in Rome during Jesus' day. And he relays all of this to the king. And as you can imagine, the king was astounded, to say the least. Look at verses 34 and 35. Because he tells them about all of this, and then he says, oh yeah, you watched, verse 34, while a stone was cut without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them to pieces. Then the iron and clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together, and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away, so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. Listen, this stone kingdom is going to be the pivot point for the entire rest of the book of Daniel. All of these other kingdoms, as great as they were, as powerful as they were, as outstretching and overarching as they were, as rich as they were, they're never going to last. There's only one kingdom that will last, and that is the stone kingdom. And we went earlier, and we went to the New Testament. We saw all of the references made about the stone and the connection with Christ. And we know that to be the kingdom of Christ. And not only is it a stone, but it grows, and it grows into a mountain, and that mountain fills the entire earth. And we talked about the fact that the kingdom of Christ is alive and growing, moment by moment, day by day, even to this day. The kingdom of Christ is growing. So, we move on to chapter number 3. We see in chapter number 3, we watch Nebuchadnezzar build a 90-foot golden image of himself. That's why I said earlier, when Nebuchadnezzar heard the head of gold and he was the king of that head of gold, that was it for him. He was so full of himself, he didn't need to hear or didn't hear anything else. So he goes out and erects a 90-foot tall structure made of solid gold. He's telling Daniel and he's telling God, I don't care what that dream said, Babylon will last forever. That's why his statue goes gold from head to toe. Oh, really? Is that true? That's what he thought. So with this 90-foot statue that he casts of himself, he invites all of the dignitaries of the kingdom to come to the inauguration of the 90-foot image. Instruction was given that when the music started, everyone was to bow down and worship the golden image. Funny that Daniel's not mentioned in chapter number 3. And there's much speculation to why, but most likely he was out on some sort of duty for the king, because he was elevated in the kingdom after he gave the king's dream and the interpretation. So he was probably outside of the country, probably in a foreign land, doing something for the king. And he's not mentioned here in chapter number 3. That's the most logical argument that we find. But we do know there were some other guys. Their new names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We know those names, right? Those were their non-Yahweh names. They were the names given to them in Babylon. Well, we see that when the music starts, they stand. Can you imagine, as an entire crowd, there were thousands in attendance most likely, as they fall on their faces onto their knees and bow, do you think, looking out over that sea of people, 3 guys standing up would look a little out of place? Well, they did. And because they had jealous folks in their midst. Remember, there was some jealousy played here, because there were guys who spent all the money on college who never got to be the dignitaries that they were. So they were watching them very close, and as soon as they didn't bow, they go, oh, whoa, 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 Nebi, I need to tell you, those three guys, they weren't bowing. So Nebuchadnezzar brings them in for a private meeting, and he says, guys, maybe you didn't hear the first instruction. So I'll give it to you a little bit louder and a little bit slower this time so that you understand what's going to happen. When the beat drops, so do you. And they said, King, we're not going to bow. So whether you throw us in that fiery furnace or God saves us miraculously, either way the answer is still the same. We're not going to bow. And we know the story, right? Did they bow? Did they burn? Look at verse 24 and 25 in this chapter number 3. Verses 24 and 25. King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. Look, he answered, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. God saved them in the fire. In the fire. In the fire. How many times do we want to be out of the fire? God, just get me out of this. Just get me out of this. Just get me out of this. And generally, that's not God's plan. He saved them in the fire by protecting them in the flames by sending Jesus. And we saw that as a Christophany. That's an appearance of Jesus before His incarnation, before Christmas morning, if you will. Well, immediately Nebuchadnezzar made it illegal to worship any deity but God. He made it illegal. And we look at that and we say, that was nice. What we don't see is God's protecting hand over His people. You see, if God would have not stepped in and stopped the idol worship, there were only 3 Jewish young men who did not bow. There were other Jews in those numbers who did. If God would not have providentially stepped in, I keep saying that, stepped in and stopped idol worship, the tribe of Judah and a few Benjaminites would have went out of existence like the 10 northern tribes did in Assyria captivity, because God did not step in to the Assyrian takeover and have those people stop their idol worship. They continued in it, and then they were brought right into culture and assimilated into Assyrian culture altogether. But here, it's a miracle. God steps in, changes the heart of the king. Now, he's not saved yet. He's not reborn yet. But he does see this miracle happen, and he makes it illegal for anyone to worship anyone except the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Chapter number 4. The king had yet another dream. This dream was of a tree. This tree grew and it filled the earth, and the tree gave shade and it gave food to all the creatures of the earth. And an angel showed up in the dream and said, chop it down, but leave the stump and put a gold band around its stump. Daniel interpreted this second dream of the king. And he told the king that the tree was him. It was King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, we saw early on that King Nebuchadnezzar was involved in his own dream by being the head of gold. And now Daniel tells him he is this tree. And the kingdom of Babylon is this large outreach that had covered the entire then known world. And this tree gave shade to all the critters, and it gave food to all the animals. But if you don't shape up and lose your attitude, when it says about being cut down, God is going to come in and cut this tree down. Although He'll leave a stump with a gold band, your kingdom will be there in some form waiting for you when you get back, but you're not going to like what happens to you, King. As a matter of fact, you're going to go out of your mind and you're going to eat grass like an ox, and your nails are going to grow long and your hair will grow like feathers. So you better straighten up. We see for 1 year, it says for 12 months. For 1 year, Nebuchadnezzar cooled his jets. Then one day, he overlooked Babylon as he's walking some morning and looking at this great Babylon, and he says, "Look at this Babylon that I have built." And as soon as he said those words, look at verse 33 of chapter number 4. That very hour the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men. He ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. He went out of his mind. They had to put him outside of the kingdom. You wouldn't want your king running around like that, would you? They had to put him outside of the kingdom. And he stays out there, his hair grows long, his nails grow, and he stays out there for 7 years. And finally, after 7 years, God begins to bring his sanity back to him once again. And he falls on his face. His kingdom is restored miraculously. That stump was left. The stump was still there. He had a kingdom to go back to. And he went back to that kingdom. And from that time on, Nebuchadnezzar was a believer. He praised God, gave God the title of being superior in all things. He said, "I thought I was, but now I see who's really in charge. It is Yahweh." And he doesn't live much longer after that. But Nebi was definitely humbled of his pride in that moment, just like God said he would be. Chapter number 5. In this chapter, we see Nebuchadnezzar is off the scene. We don't read of Nebuchadnezzar, we actually read of Belshazzar. And Belshazzar is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And Belshazzar is a co-regent. So he's a king / with his dad. His dad was a king, he was a co-regent. He was kind of a up-and-coming, in-training kind of king. His dad's name was Nabonidus. Nabonidus. We watched as Belshazzar threw a drunk fest. All the while, the city was surrounded by the Medo-Persian army. Belshazzar, in his drunk fest, was actually defying the armies of Persia, Medo-Persia. He was defying them. And he's saying in this drunk fest that we are so not scared of you that I can lay in the street puking drunk as the king, and no one in my kingdom's even going to get scared. Because the walls of Babylon are completely impenetrable. You guys can stay out there for as long as you want. If you think you're going to besiege this city by sitting outside of there and waiting us out till we starve, we've got 25 years worth of dry goods and things to take care of us. We will outwait you. So this drunk fest goes on in defiance of those armies. The whole leadership of the country's flat out drunk. And people in the city aren't even afraid because they know their walls will protect them. Well, the party reaches a fever pitch when Belshazzar sent for the golden vessels from the temple in Jerusalem. Remember, in the temple of Jerusalem, when Nebuchadnezzar went in there, he stole some of the goods. He took them. And there were other things that were large in gold. And they couldn't really be hauled well, so they melted them down and casted them into small bars so that they could load them on carts and get them out of there. But some of the smaller vessels that were easily carried, they didn't have to melt them down. So some of these vessels included goblets, bowls, shovels, things like that. Well, Belshazzar calls for all of those golden vessels to be brought out of the closet, and they fill them with wine, and they party with these golden vessels. Vessels that God had said were set up for holy use, just for the use in the temple. They were dedicated that way. And they profaned these vessels by involving them in their drunk fest. We see a toast is given. They would often do this. On the plaster of the walls, dignitaries would stand up during one of these parties and they would say, "Attention, I would like to make a toast to the king." And they would actually write these toasts on the plaster on the walls inside these banquet halls. So God shows up. A finger appears. And God says, "I'm going to write my own toast to Belshazzar on the wall in the plaster." So this hand begins to move and this finger gouges these words into the wall. The words were, "Mene, Mene, Tekel Upharsin." And when that happened, everybody sobered up quick. Look at verses 26 through 28. Verse 26. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Daniel gets called into the party. Now he's an old man by this point, very old man. He's in his 70s. So he's probably trying to sleep during this party time. Okay? Picture yourself. You're trying to sleep. And all night long, right? That's what it would have sounded like. They enjoyed techno music. He's trying to sleep. And someone comes and wakes him up in the middle of the night and says, "You need to come see the king." Can you imagine that he was in a great mood when he showed up to visit the king? Probably not. And we see the way he talks to the king. He was definitely not in a very good mood. So Daniel shows up and he lets them know, here's what that means. Because they wanted to know, tell us what those words mean. He said, your kingdom has been weighed and you've been found lacking. And your kingdom this very night will be handed over to the Medo-Persian army. And Belshazzar says, "Ha ha! No way. As a matter of fact, I'm so sure that they're not going to take us over, I'm going to move you up a rank in your standing in our government. And I'm going to give you this fancy coat that you can wear that shows everybody that you're this official." He was so sure that he moved Daniel up in rank. Meanwhile, just outside of the city, unaware to the drunks at the party, the Medo-Persian army were damming up the Euphrates River that ran directly through under the walls in Babylon. They dammed up and diverted the Euphrates River, and they walked under the wall completely unimpeded. And they walked into town and they slit Belshazzar's throat that night. And now Darius the Mede is in charge. It went that fast. Babylon is done. Medo-Persia is now in charge. One night. It happened that fast. Chapter number 6. Before we move to chapter 6, chapters number 4 and 5 have something in common. Two men that are very arrogant in Nebuchadnezzar and his grandson Belshazzar. They differ in another way to where Nebuchadnezzar was humbled when confronted with his own arrogant tendencies. His grandson, however, was not humbled. Not whatsoever. As a matter of fact, he laughed in the face of God after the interpretation of the writing on the wall was given. And he dies. So there's something the same between those two verses, and there's something very different in those two chapters. Now on to chapter number 6. Daniel has some jealous enemies in the kingdom. They don't like the fact that he keeps getting promoted in rank. Think about the fact that he was a high-ranking official in the Babylonian government. Well, guess what happens when Darius comes in and slits the throat of Belshazzar? He grabs Daniel and moves him up in the rank in his own new government. So they can't even get this guy out of office with a hostile takeover. God has been protecting them, Daniel. Because imagine that night he puts on this coat with this color on it. When the enemy comes in, they would have been looking for a coat of that color for someone to get rid of. But God protects Daniel. And in the takeover, Darius the Mede comes in and moves Daniel up a rank in his brand new established government. So he has some enemies. So they thought the only way we can get rid of this guy, we've got to go through all of his records, because Daniel's job, as well as some of these men, they had a job of being bean counters in one way. They were to find out money coming in and money going out. Money coming in, money going out. And they were like a gas meter, right? They're taking everything in and wanting to know how much goes out. And they're counting all of this money. This is how it was set up. So they thought all we have to do is go back through some of his records. We'll find somewhere that he cheated and we'll get him out of office that way. And they spend some time going over all of Daniel's paperwork, and they can find nothing on him. Nothing. How many of us would just open up everything we have at our workplace and say, check out everything I do. Make sure that I didn't spend an extra 1 minute at lunchtime. Or we wouldn't want someone investigating us. Yet they did, and they found absolutely nothing, right? So they said the only thing we can find on this guy is we know he's really religious and he prays to this Jewish God. So we have to make a law. And we got to make a law that says anybody that prays to anybody, then King Darius goes to the lion's den. That sounds like a great idea. So they go to King Darius and they begin to show him a little bit of his own uplifting kingship. And they say, King, you need to make a rule. We think everybody should be worshiping you. And if anybody's found worshiping anybody but you, they need to be thrown in the lion's den. So they trick him into signing this executive order, and he signs it. But he doesn't really even know what he's signing, because he really likes Daniel. And they said, remember, King, don't try to change this, because this is the law of the Medes and Persians. And we know through history that the law of the Medes and Persians, once it was written, could not be changed for any reason, even by the person who wrote it. So Daniel hears the fact that a law has been made that anyone who worships anyone other than the king will be thrown into the lion's den. In verse number 10. In chapter 6. It says, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home and he did different than he ever did any other day. He didn't pray anymore. he took down all of his Yahweh signs out of his window and he put up Darius signs? Oh no, that's not what verse 10 says. He went home, and in his upper room with the windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since the early days. He didn't change anything. Now, he didn't do anything purposely in the king's face. He didn't na-na-na-na-na to the king, but he didn't change anything that he did. So Daniel, after hearing the decree, went out and did the very same thing that he always did, with the windows open. So guess what? He was caught and he was thrown to the lions. But God protected him through the night. And when the king, who couldn't sleep all night long, because he really liked Daniel, and he didn't really want to see Daniel die, but he had signed the decree, so it couldn't be changed. So he's up all night fretting and wringing his hands and probably pacing the floor. He shows up first light, and he hollers in, "Daniel, Daniel, has your God been able to save you?" And Daniel says, "I'm unharmed, King. Unharmed altogether. God has shut the mouths of the lion." And when the king had the stone rolled away from the mouth of the den, Daniel was completely unharmed. Probably lying with the lions. That's my view of it. Stroking their mane, right? They're probably licking his feet. You know, it's that kind of thing. Now, King Darius realizes that he'd been tricked into signing an executive order against Daniel and him personally. So he goes and finds all the men who were involved in it, and he throws them to the lions. And wait, not only them, but he goes and gets their wives and children as well. And their nephews and nieces, all of their families were thrown in as well. And they were devoured. It says their bones were broken and they were torn in pieces before they even hit the floor of the den. And there are those that will say, well, God had just fed the lions before Daniel got in there, so they weren't hungry enough to eat Daniel. They were certainly the very next morning hungry enough to eat families, plural. So I would say that's probably not true. So, the first 6 chapters are written in narrative form, like a story. That's the narrative form. The last 6 chapters that we are entering into are Daniel's prophetic writings of how God is going to deal with Daniel's people, the Jews, and how He's going to deal with them after they leave Babylonian captivity. So the first 6 chapters are narrative with a bit of prophecy peppered in amongst it. And the last 6 chapters are prophecy with a little bit of narrative sprinkled along the way. So there's a sharp delineation here between chapter 6 and as we move into chapter number 7. Chapter number 7. Daniel has a vision of 4 beasts. These 4 beasts are a direct representation of the next 4 beastly earthly kingdoms. We know that the lion here in this vision was a representative of Babylon. The bear with the ribs in its mouth was a direct representation of Medo-Persia. The leopard was Greece, led by Alexander the Great. And that leopard was fast, and that leopard had wings on, which made it faster, right? Leopard on nitrous. It was much faster, and that's how Alexander swept across the then known world. So that leopard with wings was a direct representation of the Grecian armies. And the most ferocious of all of them could not even be described by Daniel. And that was a picture of Rome. We'll see that in chapter number 11 as we move forward, because we haven't seen Rome to this point. These beastly, evil empires would only ever cause destruction and mayhem and leave a wake of death behind. And this actually troubled Daniel very greatly. That his people were actually going to leave Babylonian captivity only to be thrown into yet another violent, earthly, beastly kingdom. And it troubled Daniel greatly. Look at verses 13 and 14 in chapter number 7. So how did God fix Daniel's great depression that he was in after hearing about these earthly, beastly kingdoms? He transports him in his vision to heaven. And he sees God, and he sees all of these flaming wheels there. And in verse 13, he says, I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and the kingdom, the one that shall not be destroyed. It's the very same thing that we have coming from chapter number 2 with the Son. Amen.
It is well with my soul, my sin. It is well. It is well.